Hello everyone. We're very happy to welcome you to this last event of the 2022 History of Games conference. And we're super happy to welcome Wendi Sierra as our concluding keynote. When I invited Wendi Sierra to perform here, it was because I was starting to feel nostalgic for Morrowind, the third Elder Scrolls. And I tried to actually play the game before this keynote today, and my Xbox died on me and I couldn't. But I'm really glad that we have scholars who take the time to reanimate this history and show us the wonders of the game design and the world building. And that's the main topic of Wendi's book on Todd, the main designer of the Elder Scrolls series going forward after Morrowind. And yeah, the notion of world building, the many intricacies it implies, the notion of virtual unreality, the modding scene of the Elder Scrolls series. There are so many engaging topics in this book. I highly recommend it. And we're very happy that Prof. Sierra has prepared a 1-hour keynote on the topic today. And I'm really happy to welcome you, Wendi. You take it away.
Awesome. Let me just get my screen sharing going and we'll be on our way. Cool. So I want to start out with a personal anecdote about Morrowind. This game has a special place in my heart, and so when Carl asked me to do not just the keynote, but specifically about the keynote about Morrowind, I was really excited. I grew up as the child of gamers. We always had computers and consoles in the home, and so my earliest memories are playing Bubble Bobble with my mother or watching my dad play Legend of Zelda. I don't know if anybody recalls Snake, Rattle, and Roll, but that was like a particular spot of frustration in my life as a young child. And so I played video games as a regular part of my home life, really up through about late middle school into early high school. And then I had an experience that I have, in talking with other female gamers, found is very common, where my friends and my peer group all sort of gave me this messaging that this wasn't for me. I didn't belong in this community. I didn't fit there. And so I stopped playing video games for what felt like an eternity to me at the time as a young person, but was really just into early college. When I was in college, I lived with somebody that had an Xbox and was a gamer. And one day when we were out at the store, they said, you ought to pick up something. You ought to get a game and play something yourself. And so I went and looked at the bargain bin and perused a couple titles, and just by chance ended up grabbing the Game of the Year edition of Morrowind. And I don't know why, of all the games that I could have grabbed, it was this weird game in a strange place with an incredibly frustrating journal system and a very unforgiving new player experience that hooked me. But it was this game that got me back into gaming. I became obsessed with the game. If I wasn't playing the game, I was looking at game facts back in the day, looking up walkthroughs and secrets and tips, how to make a good character. I think that my junior level lit theory grade probably suffered substantially based on Elder Scrolls Morrowind, but I feel like Hemingway's reputation probably can survive me writing a terrible seminar paper in junior year. And now I am an associate professor of games. All the courses I teach are about games. And so in a sense, I owe my career to Morrowind bringing me back into gaming and getting me excited about games again and feeling like I enjoyed it and I belonged. But we're not here to talk about what gaming means to me. We're here to talk about Morrowind at 20, which I ironically realized we didn't plan it this way, but we're talking about Morrowind at 20 on the day of Skyrim's 11th anniversary. Skyrim was 11/11/11, so a very fortuitous day, I suppose. I want to make the argument in this presentation that Elder Scrolls is the most important, I'm sorry, Morrowind is the most important of the Elder Scroll games for Bethesda as a studio. And I think that you can really, if you look at their history and their games, you can divide the studio into before Morrowind and after Morrowind. So that's sort of the basis for my claim. And to get there, we're going to look at Bethesda's history, where they started, what happened before Morrowind, the hallmarks of the Bethesda style that Morrowind introduces that become essential for their later games, and then we'll just briefly close down by talking about Morrowind's legacy. As Carl mentioned, all of this is pulled from my book, which is more broadly on Todd Howard and his world building perspective, and covers basically Morrowind through Fallout 4. So if you're interested in these ideas, or especially more about how some of these elements play into the later games, I don't get into that so much in this presentation, but absolutely it's in the book. So this is something I always enjoy sharing with my video game history students, because I think in contemporary students, young 20-year-olds, they have a very particular image of who Bethesda is and what they do. And it's an image that's shaped on what the studio has done since Morrowind, which is a very specific style of gameplay, and typically only working on one game at a time, or very close to only one game at a time. But in the early days, Bethesda was actually much more expansive, and had success in a couple different genres before settling into this open world RPG frame that we know them for now. So Bethesda is founded by Chris Weaver in '86. Their first game is Gridiron. I'll talk more about Gridiron in just a moment. But they have a lot of modest success with some of these sports games. They have other ones as well. There are some racing titles. These are just a few that I've suggested, that I've pulled as illustrative examples. Wayne Gretzky is definitely the most popular of their early sporting games. This one is fairly highly regarded as a hockey game. A modest success, gets a number of sequels. The phrase modest success is probably a good definition of this early period of Bethesda's growth. They don't have many breakaway hits, but they have enough that they keep the lights on, they keep expanding, they keep adding developers. NCAA basketball road to the Final Four, an interesting moment in Bethesda history, not a particularly successful basketball game. That one was not particularly well reviewed. One of the things that is really interesting about the first Gridiron, if you look at the gameplay image, which is on the top left up there, this is not a beautiful game. And it didn't set out to be a beautiful game. The graphics were basically the last consideration for Gridiron. Instead, Ed Fletcher, who is the programmer behind this, is really interested in the physics of the game and in trying to come up with the most accurate, from a physics perspective, football game that he can. So things like the weight of your players matter when they tackle. Momentum matters when they tackle, right? And he took all of this into consideration, trying to think about the physics for the ball and the physics for the players, and did not put a very pretty game together, but put a game that mimics actual physics fairly well. Interestingly, Trip Hawkins has had the idea for a while to make a football game, gets interested in Gridiron and specifically the physics in Gridiron, but wants to do something more visually accurate to football as well. Doesn't want to sacrifice the graphics in order to get the good physics. And so fairly on in Bethesda's history, EA actually contracts with Bethesda to help them develop John Madden Football. And the terms of the agreement are that Bethesda will help EA specifically with these physics, and EA will help Bethesda with their publishing, will help them do some cross-platform stuff, and we'll get a broader audience for Gridiron, which the first few copies were like distributed in plastic baggies. That's the era of gaming that we're talking about. So Bethesda helps EA. They write code that does end up going into that first John Madden football game. But EA's reciprocal support for Bethesda never materializes. There are no more releases for Gridiron. There are no cross-platform versions of Gridiron. And so in a move that would become classic, I think, both for Bethesda and for EA, Bethesda sues EA. The settlement ends up, they end up settling out of court, and because it's a settlement, those records are sealed. But what we do know is that after this happens, Bethesda as a studio grows, and they began working on a large number of new titles. So there's some speculation as to who that settlement ended up benefiting and what happened there. I also like sharing this with my video game history students because they have very contemporary notions of how and why we should hate EA. And I like pointing them to the long history there as well. So Bethesda didn't just have success in sports games. Bethesda is also getting into the shooter and specifically licensed games. And far and away, their most popular licensed franchise that they work with is the Terminator series. So Bethesda's first Terminator game, which you see on the left side up here, is the Terminator released in 1991. And that is directed by Julian LeFay, who would go on to direct Arena and Daggerfall. One of the interesting things about this first Terminator game is that it does include an element of choice for players. So in this game, you can choose to play either as Kyle, and your job is then to protect Sarah Connor, or you can play as the Terminator, and your job is to try to assassinate Sarah Connor. So this game is fairly successful, and it's seen as very faithful to the adaptation. Some of the later games explore other areas of the Terminator mythos and aren't as faithful to the movie source material. They follow up the first Terminator game with Terminator 2029 in 92 and Terminator Rampage in 93. 2029 receives reasonably positive reviews. Again, a modest success. Unfortunately, Terminator Rampage releases in the same year as Doom, and it does not stand up at all to Doom. All of the reviews for Terminator Rampage are comparing it unfavorably. This is a sad shadow of what Doom is doing. Future Shock and Skynet follow a sort of similar trajectory with regards to Quake. So Future Shock is seen as kind of interesting, doing some novel things, comes out in 95. Skynet comes out in 96, which is the same year as Quake, and is again utterly blown out of the water by Quake and compared very poorly to Quake. Future Shock is sort of interesting because this is one of the early games where Todd Howard is working actually on programming with Bethesda. And he says that some of the level design stuff that he worked on in Future Shock, building the world from the ground up, becomes very influential for him in later games. Now that Todd Howard has become the sort of talking head for Bethesda, he has joked at GDC conferences that now that their shared parent company, ZeniMax, owns both Bethesda Game Studios and id, they can ensure that their games never have competing release dates like this again. So there's still a little bitterness at Bethesda for how some of these Terminator games, which are fairly decent shooters for the time, just get stomped by its shooters that are out at the time. So Bethesda is playing around in a variety of different genres. They're doing sports games, they're doing shooters, and the design team is excited by fantasy settings. We're talking about the era of wizardry, we're talking about the era of Ultima, and these are the kind of things that are in their mind. The design team also has a weekly Dungeons and Dragons game, the campaign setting for which apparently heavily influences Arena in the early days. So this is Bethesda's real first foray into fantasy, but Arena doesn't actually start out as a role-playing game. The initial idea for Arena, as the name might suggest, is that it will be a gladiatorial combat game. So you'll have a band of 4 adventurers, which you see in the cover art there, and you'll go around to these different towns and you'll compete in gladiatorial combat in each of these towns. And to spice that up, to make it a little more interesting, the designers start working on side quests that you can do while you're in the town going to fight the battle. Ultimately, they decide that these side quests are the more interesting part of the game, and the arena combat ends up getting left out of the game entirely. So you really only see vestiges of that early original idea in the name and the marketing materials. The arena combat doesn't even make it to the code stage before they switch things. But by that point, they've already trademarked the name and they've already made up some of these marketing materials. So initially, the addition of the phrase Elder Scrolls comes not out of any sense of deep lore or profound world building, but it's a way to try to make this name Arena make sense for a game that's no longer about arenas at all. They also come up with some in-game lore about how this area of the world is so violent that it's referred to as the arena, as a way to try to make it make sense. Initial sales for Arena are pretty slow, and there are potentially a couple reasons for that. I can't help but think that this box art that we have up here is not doing them any favors in terms of conveying what the game is or what the game's about. They're also originally planned for a holiday '93 launch, and due to a bunch of delays, that gets pushed back to late March '94 before the game is actually out. So that probably has some impact as well. Arena is fairly well received. A trend that anybody who's familiar with Bethesda game knows is that it's very buggy, and this is a complaint, but it does get a decent enough following. There's enough faith in the intellectual property in the franchise that Bethesda does go on to make a sequel. The goal with Daggerfall is to be bigger, basically. The things that people loved about the original Arena were the open world exploration and the character creation. And so Bethesda sets out to really capitalize on those things and make the biggest RPG they possibly can. Interestingly, some of the early concepts are actually set in Morrowind, but that's just early design documents. That doesn't make it very far into the process at all, and it's quickly changed to High Rock and Hammerfall, which is where the game ends up being set. Some interesting stats for Daggerfall. So as I mentioned, the goal for this game is to make it bigger. And one of the main ways that is frequently cited that they do this is procedurally generating the terrain. So this is procedurally generated at the design stage versus procedurally generated after the fact. A game like Minecraft is procedurally generated when you start the game. Everybody has a different world. This is not what Daggerfall is doing. Daggerfall is procedurally generated at the design phase, and then everyone has their own world. Everyone interacts in the same world, basically. So that 62,000 square miles of terrain is the largest map in Elder Scrolls and is still one of the biggest maps in gaming, especially in terms of single player games. Yeah, 75,000 NPCs. This is definitely a number that we see go down, and especially when I'll talk about NPCs in Morrowind, there's some question for how we count NPCs. So this isn't 75,000 named NPCs, right? This is just NPCs in the world. Later on, we really start to get to the distinction between named and not named NPCs. 15,000 settlements, 227 quests with an asterisk next to it. So one of the interesting things that Daggerfall does is they introduce randomized quests. So your main quest, your faction quests, those are all the same. Those are all storyline quests. But, you know, innkeepers in the world, people on the street in the world could give you a quest. And that quest would basically be a Mad Lib style randomized, where they might ask for X number of animals to be killed from X location in X number of days, right? So in a sense, there could be an infinite number of quests, but because those parameters are so rigid for what those random quests could be, 227 is usually the agreed upon number. Also, 90 hours to meet the main story of the game, 306 hours for a completionist run. And this is in an era when Ultima games are running at about 90 hours. I want to say, I'm sorry, 30 hours. I want to say Diablo was something like 16 or 19 hours. So in terms of gameplay, this thing is massively bigger than a lot of other games as well. This again follows the trend that we're going to see. It is definitely critiqued for being very buggy. Howard, reflecting on Daggerfall, notes that they perhaps bit off a bit more than they can chew, which I think you can see in some of these stats, and that ended up resulting in a lot of the bugs. This does seem to be a trend that we see going forward in Bethesda. Regardless, this is a big success for Bethesda. This game, I want to say, I've got it on a later slide. I want to say it's 190,000 copies that it sells. So it's one of their most successful games to date. And after this particular game, we see the studio really spread out. They start tackling a whole bunch of different games at the same time. We have more of the sports games, some of those, the later Terminator games. They start working on 2 new Elder Scrolls games. Allegedly, there's a 3rd game that we don't have a lot of Elder Scrolls game that doesn't get a lot of information. They spread the team very thin, and this ends up becoming a problem when a lot of those games either get canceled or don't get well received. So the moment immediately following Daggerfall is sort of the high point and the greatest expansion for early Bethesda. And then right after that, we're looking at a sharp and severe contraction. And we'll talk about why that happens. Starfield is not Bethesda's first foray into the sci-fi genre. In this era, following Daggerfall, they had several different games that they were working on, and one of them was called 10th Planet. In this game, they were partnering with a special effects company to try to bring you, as it says here, unparalleled 3D graphics. So they're really trying to push both the graphics, the cutscene, and the lighting in this game to make it just a technically beautiful game. As you can see here, it does get as far as early marketing and advertising, and they do put a fair amount of work into this game, even having an announced release date of November 97, which gets pushed back to 98 and then to 99 before it eventually gets canceled. Bethesda has never said officially what happened with this game, why it got canceled, but there are a couple of things that we can read between the lines. One is that the special effects company that they're partnering with ends up pulling out of the partnership entirely to work solely on movies. So that leaves them a bit in a lurch. Additionally, they're trying to work on new and novel versions of lighting design in games that seems to be just a bit ahead of the time for the technology that they have available. Whatever the reason, this game getting canceled is one of the early signs that things are starting to go downhill for Bethesda. They sink a good amount of money, a good amount of development time into this, and it never sees the light of day. Although there are in some Starfield trailers references to various insignia and things from 10th Planet. So there are some hints of this in upcoming games. Another early stumble for Bethesda is Battlespire and Redguard. So the studio has an idea, which I think is not necessarily a bad one, that since they have a successful intellectual property in Elder Scrolls and Tamriel and the mythos that they're building, that maybe one of the things that they can do is take this property, and spin it out into different genres. Because as we've seen at this point in time, they're working in a variety of different genres. They're not only working in the RPG space. So Battlespire is one of their attempts to do this. And you'll see this isn't Elder Scrolls : Battlespire. This is an Elder Scrolls Legend Battlespire. The idea being that the Legends series would spin off and become a whole bunch of games in a different genre that are in the Elder Scrolls world. Sadly, this basically loses all of the things that people love about Daggerfall. So I think in reading reviews of this game, the most common word that you see repeated is limited. People feel that this game is a Daggerfall, but severely limited. The character creation is much more limited. The leveling system, it doesn't even read as a true leveling system to many people, though you do advanced, so that's seen as limited. It's essentially an action-adventure dungeon crawler. Everything takes place in the eponymous Battlespire. So you have various levels and you're trying to fight your way to the top of the Battlespire. I included the Computer Gaming World rating here. You can see they gave it 2 stars out of 5 and generally did not recommend it. There are a few interesting features in this. So one of the things that they have is that if you have high enough points in certain skills, you can talk to some of the enemies. So you can see that here. This is a dialogue screen with an enemy. And depending on your interaction with them, you can, sometimes you just gain information from them and then you go on to fight them. Sometimes you can persuade them to be neutral, and so you can get around some fights. Some of the enemies, you can even persuade them to fight by your side, and then at least until they die, you have a companion with you. So that's kind of an interesting idea. We see versions of this in later Elder Scrolls games. They also included co-op and multiplayer in this game, which was pretty novel, especially for the Elder Scrolls series. So the multiplayer was sort of a deathmatch type scenario. You were just fighting the other player, and then the co-op was a true co-op. You're exploring Battlespire together. Regardless, this was a huge investment and a huge flop. It did not sell well at all, and it was not critically received. So we're starting to have cascading problems between canceled games and poorly received games. And then we go on to Redguard. Like Battlespire, Redguard is an attempt to take this mythos and play with it in a different genre. So this game is most akin to, if you think of like an adventure platformer like Prince of Persia, not an RPG at all by any means. That's the idea behind this game. And so this one, where the other one was an Elder Scrolls Legend, this is the Elder Scrolls Adventures, right? One of the interesting things about Redguard is that this is Todd Howard's first chance to lead a design team on an Elder Scrolls game. And he has some ideas based on Daggerfall for what he's going to do in this game. So one of his big criticisms of Daggerfall is that he feels that the world is too generic, in part because of the procedural generation, and in part because they're leaning heavily on Tolkien-esque tropes. This is a little ironic if you've played any of Oblivion, which gets critiqued for being a bit too generic and relying on Tolkien-esque tropes. But this is what he's reacting against in this game. And so with Redguard, it's on a very, very small island, Stros Mackay. You don't have very much that you can interact with, but he really places a premium on handcrafting this world, on designing everything from the ground up, making every space unique, making every space feel like it has character. He insists on voice acting to try to bring the NPCs to life. I don't know if anybody has played this game. I personally can't recommend it. And it's interesting to me that the voice acting was a priority, having heard some of the voices that they have in this game. I think I'll leave it at that. Regardless, it's still seen as pretty narrow compared to Daggerfall. Again, remember those Daggerfall stats and the fact that people loved how big it was. And now you have this action adventure game set on a small island. Interestingly, Redguard actually gets some pretty decent reviews. Again, I've got Computer Gaming World up over here, but across a variety of gaming publications, it gets fairly decent scores. It's not trashed the way Battlespire is. It just definitely doesn't find an audience. This game does not sell well at all. And while it has critically good reviews, it is a commercial failure. It ends up getting nominated for Adventure Game of the Year and loses to Grim Fandango, which I feel like is probably the right choice in that scenario. Regardless, this puts Bethesda in a really tight position. They've had several games that have been unsuccessful and a couple games that have been canceled. Again, there's a third Elder Scrolls game that ends up getting canceled. There's allegedly another licensed game that was canceled. And then these games that are not selling well. So after Daggerfall, we see an explosion. The studio is hiring lots of people. It's working on lots of projects. After these games, we see an immediate contraction. There are layoffs going on. The design team is incredibly shrunk down. This is also the point at which Bethesda separates into Bethesda Softworks and Bethesda Game Studios. So up until this point, Bethesda has been both a publisher, mostly of its own games, but also of some other studios' games, and a developer. With the studio in trouble, ZeniMax Media, who is also owned by Chris Weaver, comes in and does a buyout. And as part of that buyout, they split the development studio and the publishing side entirely so that they're now completely separate companies. And the design studio is basically told, you sink or you swim based on your next game, which ends up being Morrowind. So we're at a rough point in Bethesda history. The studio has to make Morrowind work or the studio closes. That's the position they're given. There's no other games that they're working on. It's all on this game. Coming into Morrowind, there are a couple of different ideas for how the game should be. Particularly Julian LaFay, who had been the lead on the previous two Elder Scrolls games, has some ideas about continuity that he really wants to get introduced. He actually had this idea in Daggerfall that the same way that you would carry one character through multiple D&D campaigns, you should be able to carry one character across your Elder Scrolls games. Now, they can't make this work with the transition from Arena to Daggerfall because, as I said earlier, they expand the character system so much that an Arena character just doesn't fit in the Daggerfall system. But early on, this is one of the ideas that he wants to keep. This ends up getting chucked and doesn't make it into the final project, but it's one of their ideas. Similarly, early on, there's an idea that the multiple endings that a player might have gotten in Daggerfall would have some effect on the third Elder Scrolls game. So there are 8 possible endings at the end of Daggerfall, depending on how certain situations play out. And some of those endings are contradictory. LaFay wants those to inform the world of Elder Scrolls 3 and the quests that you have available in Elder Scrolls 3. This idea also doesn't end up making it into the final game. What they do instead to handle it is they introduce this idea of dragon breaks. So the dragon is time, and the break is the idea that time fractures. And all of these possible endings, even the contradictory ones, all happen at the same time, and then time comes back together sometime after the dragon break. So that's their way of sort of getting around the idea of authorizing which ending is correct. Another early idea from Ken Rolston is that this this new game should focus on the High Elves. And along with that idea, he develops out an elaborate system of noble interactions and court decorum and things like this. The game, as we now know, ends up focusing on Vardenfell and the Dark Elves instead of focusing on the High Elves, But those ideas that he initially had actually do make it into the final game in the form of the various high houses that are incredibly important to the main story in the game. At this point, I'm gonna pause briefly for a nostalgia moment, and I will. Awesome. So I know that that was from the launch trailer for Elder Scrolls Morrowind. That video gets me right until the feels real nostalgic, up until about the moment where the player is fighting the cliff racer, and then it's rage. It's waves of rage coming back over me again. So a brief summary of the story, for those of you that are maybe a little rusty, maybe don't remember it, maybe skipped it the first time through. Like most Elder Scrolls games, you wake up as a prisoner, you're very quickly released, set loose onto the world to mostly do what you will. You're exploring Vardenfell, which is the home of the Dark Elves, and you discover that there is this mysterious plague, the Blight, going around. Strange, I guess we'll call them weather anomalies coming from the Red Mountain that we'll talk about more in a moment. Eventually, you become convinced that you are the incarnation of the Nerevar. You get the approval of all of the major factions in the land to be declared the Nerevarine, and you go through and defeat Dagoth who is the source of all of these plagues. Now, it's important to note that like most of the Elder Scrolls games, earlier exceptions aside, it's incredibly easy to completely skip this main quest and still have hours of gameplay in Morrowind. In fact, considering how sort of clunky the journal and the quest system is in this game, it's also very easy to miss the quest the first time and to take a while to find your way back to it. I would also argue that in the Elder Scrolls games in general, the main story, the main quest, is perhaps one of the least interesting aspects of the game. I think this is reflected in Todd Howard's description of his games and his definition of his design aesthetic. So one of the things that he explicitly says is the world is the main character of our games. And if you think about the gameplay loop that they've set up, it's entirely driven by player choice and player identification. So your main character is intentionally as blank a slate as they can possibly give you. And it's up to you to fill in motivation, ability, skill, action, etc. This sort of blank slate character also leads to them having, I think, less fully defined main plots, because the main plots aren't what's the most interesting thing about these games, it's the world. And so a lot of the care and the craft and the development goes into making that world as evocative and immersive as they can. I like this quote from Cresswell here as a way of thinking about the importance of the world in Elder Scrolls games. So Cresswell says, "We do not live in landscapes, we look at them." And I think it's very fair and very valid that in some games, you are meant to look at the landscape, not to live in it. But that's not the case in the Elder Scrolls games. Finally, Trent Hergenrader down here notes that the act of world building is often distinct and separate from conventional storytelling. Conventional storytelling is typically a process of narrowing down, of moving toward a central point, of closing down possibilities in order to achieve focus. And world building is usually very much the opposite. It is expansive, it is ongoing, and it is capricious. You may hit some of it, you may hit none of it. It is both less demanding and more engaging for a player, I would argue. So I'm going to go ahead and talk through 3 big elements of world building as Bethesda does them and as it relates specifically to Morrowind. We're going to start with world style, which is the thing that is very much on Howard's mind with this game, just having come off of his design experience in Redguard. We'll move on to talk a little bit about micro narratives, which are really something that starts in this era and then explodes in later eras. And then finally, we'll chat about NPCs. So as I mentioned, Howard is, in a sense, reacting against Daggerfall, which he views as too generic on a couple different levels. And so he makes the immediate decision that the landmass in Morrowind is going to be smaller, and instead of being procedurally generated, it will be handcrafted. This means that a majority of the early development time in the game goes toward creating the tools that they're going to use to craft this environment, to be able to lay all this terrain, all of these buildings, all of these things. This is also eventually what makes it easy for them to put out the toolkit, the mod toolkit that becomes such an important part of the fan culture for these games, because they put so much time into doing it in order to handcraft this world. So that's how they sort of respond to the procedurality of Daggerfall. They also respond to the theming of Daggerfall by going in a wildly different direction. So Michael Kirkbride says the game should look like Dark Crystal meets Star Wars. And I think that you really get a sense of that when you look at some of these pictures of a Stilt Strider, which is one of your main modes of transportation, and a house in Alderaan, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. Howard says it should feel alien, kind of like a stranger in a strange land. So he wants you to immediately feel like this is a very different place, a place that's not familiar to you, a place that you don't recognize. Konstantinos Dinopoulos talks about cities in games and decries the fairly banal, fairly lifeless cities that we see in a lot of video games. He looks to urban studies for examples of how cities and games could appear more vibrant. And I think that this framework is a great one to use when thinking about the things that Morrowind did well, particularly in terms of its city design. So for this, I'm going to talk about Alderaan, which is, again, the city that you see over there. So Dimopoulos suggests that cities should consider the natural environment, contain a major landmark, demonstrate historical layering, and show believable civic life. These are the things that are going to make game cities appear immersive and vibrant. You can already see over here, this is 2 different shots of the same location, one when there is no ash storm, one when there is an ash storm. So I'll talk a little bit about those. So Alderaan is a really interesting city to think about how developers are considering the natural environment as they design these spaces. You start out in an area that looks very much like the area on the right, Balmora. Balmora is the first big city that's easily accessible to you, and it's the one that you're first directed to go to as you sort of go through the early tutorial part of the game. As you can see, it is fairly bright. It does have weather patterns, but they mostly range from clear to cloudy to slight rain. So it's a fairly pleasant place to be. The trees look very familiar. We've got lots of grass, lots of rock. The architecture is not totally alien and foreign. So this place is very familiar to you. Alderaan is often the second big city that you encounter, whether you are following the main quest, which will lead you here. The faction quests will also usually lead you here if you pick up the Mages Guild or the Fighters Guild. it's also just the closest next big city. So by free wandering, you would often end here next. And you can see the area leading up to Alderaan and then Alderaan itself in the middle. So you come from this area that is bright and fairly familiar looking and fairly welcoming. If you approach just by walking, you'll see the sky get darker and darker and redder, and the landscape around you becomes more and more alien. If you take one of your forms of fast travel, the distinction between these two spaces is even more apparent as you sort of instantly appear in this weird foreboding area. Alderaan sits at the foot of the Red Mountain, which is the source of all of this light that is spreading out. The Red Mountain is obviously the red picture that you can see on the left, and I've included the weather table where you can see ash is 30% of your daily weather experience there. And these frequent ash storms that are experienced in this area shape a lot of what the settlement looks like in really interesting ways. So Demopolis' next criterion is that a city ought to both contain a major landmark and show historical layering. And one of the interesting things about Alderaan is that these sort of overlap. So the story behind this huge structure that you see in the middle of the map on the right is that this is the hollowed out shell of a giant crab. So you get some sense of history through this connection to the past of this location, which apparently once carried these mammoth creatures. All of the architecture in this area is evocative of that crab. So you can see that even in some of the smaller houses and the design of the smaller houses. This is also a primary point of shelter and insulation from the ash storms. So this is the major historical landmark. The picture on the left on the top is what it looks like inside that crab shell, and then there's a picture from afar so you can see it in game. So the last criterion is showing believable civic life. And in here, the crab shell also plays an important role. The nobles in this city all live under the crab shell in giant manors. And you can see the sort of central plaza for those manors on the right side of the screen there. The nobles that live in this area, there are also merchants under the scar, under the crab shell. So they can experience life in this very hostile environment without ever going outside if they want, or only going outside when it's clear, like you can see in the picture on the left. Additionally, if you go inside the manor while an ash storm is going on, you stop hearing the sort of oppressive wind sound that otherwise really marks this area. So there's a huge distinct in the game world between the haves and the have-nots. The less wealthy inhabitants of Alderaan live in some of these houses that are outside the city. And you can see this difference also in the quality of goods that's sold in those houses versus what's sold in the under the scar, which is kind of interesting. I also think it's very interesting. There's a Mages Guild faction and a Fighters Guild faction. Those are both outside of the scar, and there's some sort of suspicion towards them, as if they're not really part of Dark Elf society, Dark Elf life, and so they have to stay outside of the crab shell, which is pretty interesting. Either way, I think that Alderaan is a great example. You can see the sort of alien style that Howard is going for in this, and you can see the way that they're trying to evoke believable cities. So the next characteristic of Morrowind that I want to talk about is micro-narratives. Micro-narratives are a really interesting part of world building, and here is an example of one of my favorite ones, Tamriel, that we'll talk about in a moment. So micro-narratives are these narrative moments that are embedded in the game world, but they exist outside of the main plot line, the main gameplay narrative. So they're part of this expansive element of world building that is encyclopedic, that adds and adds and adds to player knowledge, whether or not it actually forwards quest progress, whether or not it forwards main story knowledge, right? One of the cool things about micronarratives is that they signal to players that a world exists before them and after them. So obviously we know that the world goes away when we hit the power button and it comes back on when we turn it on. But I think in world building, we try to create this sense for players that it's not, sort of a player-centric world with the player in the middle and everything revolving around them. That this is a vibrant place that exists before you and it'll exist after you. And there are other things going on in the world that have nothing to do with you as the player. Micronarratives are modular, so they can be encountered at any time. They can also be encountered not at all, just depending on a player's proclivities and where they go in a game. And they're cumulative. They all add to a player's store of knowledge about the world, even if they're not forwarding a main quest idea. So I'm about to talk about Tamriel in Morrowind, which is, I think, one of the best examples of micronarratives in Morrowind. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that this particular micronarrative has such resonance for players that in the Elder Scrolls Legends online card game, they printed a card called Falling Wizard that features him on it. So if you are wandering around near the starter town of Seydanin, and you go along a certain path, you will hear a high-pitched shriek, and then you will hear the sound of a body hitting the ground. And this is your introduction to the poor wizard Tamriel. If you go up to inspect him, you will find 2 scrolls of Icaran Flight. You will find a note, which I've got the text of here. I'm not going to read it. And you can, of course, loot his body for his clothes, which as an early game player, they sell pretty well. So that's always suggested. The interesting thing for me about Tamriel is that his story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they all basically happen before the player is involved at all. So in reading his note, you can discover that he finds spells of flying disorienting, and he hates having to pay people to teleport, so he has come up with his own way that he can travel long distances quickly, which is essentially to buff his agility massively. However, he does nothing to prevent fall damage. And so while he goes up just fine, when he crashes down, he dies. So this is a great example of a micro narrative because it does embed a lot of interesting things about the game world. You learn a little bit about travel options, you learn a little bit about spell making, you start to understand this place that you're in, and you get a sense that there are people that exist in it that have motives beyond just paying attention to you, the player character. An interesting thing about this particular character is that while he is supposed to always be dead when you encounter him, of course, players have figured out a workaround for how to save him, for him not to die. And that is essentially that in Morrowind, when you save a game, it saves position of objects, but it doesn't save momentum. So if you can walk into this area and then save your game before he hits the ground, when you reload the game, he'll only fall that last little bit, and then he is potentially still alive. This is entirely not intended. This is an exploit. It's not part of the micro narrative, but I do think it's interesting. So just give one more example of another type of micro narrative, one that's pretty common throughout the Elder Scrolls game. So this is the abandoned shack near Narmak. Unlike Seydanin, this is not a fairly well-traveled area, and so it's entirely possible that a player might never stumble across this abandoned shack in their explorations. Further, it's not particularly remarkable. It doesn't grab your attention in the same way that a dude falling from the sky does. And so even if you stumble across this, you might not think too much about it. Nonetheless, if you come into this on the door, you'll get a notice that this is an abandoned shack. You enter the room and you see that everything is in disarray. Bottles are strewn about on the floor. There are some gold pieces scattered around on the floor. You can find this very cryptic note, which is a sort of a stream of consciousness rambling. I have read some players arguing that it is a suicide note, though it never explicitly says that. It's very unclear what the meaning of this worn note is meant to be. You can also find an exclusive shadow potion, which is the highest level of shadow potion and will grant you chameleon in the game. And you can find 2 pearls that are undurable. So there's been some speculation about what all of this means, because unlike Tarkeel, this is a micro narrative that doesn't necessarily easily explain itself. Somebody was here, somebody had these thoughts. There's a reason that they had that shadow potion and 2 pearls, but it's very unclear what it is. And it's sort of left up to the player to decide what they think this means. I have seen some people speculating that this is maybe a lore character who was briefly here, but there's nothing in the game to confirm that. So this is another interesting example of micro narratives. Now I'll talk about something that I think is essential to Bethesda's style, is not fully realized in Morrowind, and that is NPC design. So Linkowski and Bjork come up with this sort of 9-point criteria for what potentially makes a persuasive, lifelike NPC. This isn't to say that all NPCs should have all 9 of these categories, or that you need all 9 of these categories to be believable, rather that some mix of these categories in a certain combination in certain games leads to NPCs being more believable. So NPCs should have awareness of their surroundings. They shouldn't do things like walk into chests or walk into doors. It should have visible body damage, should have dissectable bodies. NPCs should have the initiative to take actions. They should have their own agenda and a sense of self. They should have emotional attachment to actions taking place near them. If that's, a player stealing something straight in front of them. They should have contextual conversation responses, and they should have goal-driven personal development that's based on that sense of self and their own agenda. So anybody that's familiar with Morrowind probably has a good idea of where I'm going with it. Here is Caius, one of the first quest givers that you meet in Morrowind. And these are the elements of NPCs that I think Caius displays. Yeah, that's them. That's all of them. Okay, that's mostly a joke, but the NPCs in Morrowind are not great. And in some reflections on this, Howard has explicitly said that in this game, the focus is on the world, and that's where they put a lot of their effort. There are some interesting things that are done in Morrowind, but it's definitely something that they build out much, much more in Oblivion and later in Skyrim, and even we see it in the Fallout games that they develop as well. So it's worth noting that there is some level of emotional attachment. If you steal something in front of people, that will get you in trouble. There is some amount of contextual conversation responses based on what race you're playing, what class you're playing, if you've done certain faction quests, if you have a certain reputation in the game. So there is some of this, but it's pretty limited in Morrowind. It's not as fully developed. A couple notes about this. So we saw how many NPCs Daggerfall has. Morrowind has just over 2,600 NPCs, named NPCs. Now, the interesting thing that is after Morrowind, all of your sort of throwaway bad guys out in the world just get called like a bandit, right? Vampire mage, what have you. And so the number of NPCs in Oblivion and Skyrim looks much lower. Oblivion at just over 800, Skyrim at just over 900. But there are a lot of characters that don't have dialogue. All they do is attack you in a cave, but they do have a name in Morrowind. So that number of NPCs is perhaps a little high. Regardless of that, for 2,600 NPCs, they only have 14 voice actors. So it is one voice actor for all the Dunmer females, right? It is one voice actor for all of the Imperial males. It's also not a fully voice gamed. You get clips of dialogue here and there, but not everything is fully voiced. NPCs also in this game also have fairly limited rotation. So they will walk around a room that they're in, but most of them will stay fairly put in a small area. This is something that absolutely gets wildly expanded upon in Oblivion. To mixed effect, we'll say. One last thing to note about Morrowind and NPCs that's pretty interesting is while they were still fairly limited in some ways, I think that they had something in Morrowind with NPCs that was actually better than what they do later in Oblivion and Skyrim. This is also my favorite AR message from a game ever. So if you kill a character that is important to the main story, you get this error message. With this character's death, the thread of the prophecy is severed. Restore a saved game to restore the weave of fate, or persist in the doomed world you have created. And I feel like persist in the doomed world you've created in 2020 has a lot of resonance personally. But I also just enjoy the juxtaposition of the diegetic, the thread of the prophecy is severed, and the non-diegetic, revert to a saved game. Regardless, any character in Morrowind can be killed, or I should say is killable, whether you have enough armor, enough attacks to take them in battle is a question, but they are killable. In Oblivion and Skyrim, this has changed so that these main characters just get knocked out. And this is a slight compromise to the world building at the expense, it's a slight buff to the main story at the expense of the world building, right? So it's putting a slightly higher priority on that main story, the prominence the main story holds. Bethesda doesn't do this very often where it prioritizes main story, but this is one big example that in later games they do. So let's close down, talk a little bit about reception and the future. Morrowind is generally very, very well received. Again, bugs. Everybody knows the bugs, and that's fair. The combat is also somewhat criticized as not being the best part of the game. I think that is also very fair. But across a lot of publications, it's very, very well received. It's one of the first expansive open world RPGs like this on a console, releasing on the Xbox. So that's a big win for them. Ends up selling about 4 million copies. And here I've got some of the sales data. As you know, it's hard to get sales data for a lot of games. And especially we'll talk about that Elder Scrolls Skyrim number because that number is definitely way low, but we'll come back to it. You can see here, though, the turning point in Bethesda history with who they were before Morrowind and who they become after Morrowind. And it's very heavily influenced by the design style that is introduced in Morrowind, these features that come through in Morrowind and really connect with an audience and become central to their design philosophy and the type of game that they will continue to develop. So in a DICE keynote, Howard breaks down the different foci of the Elder Scrolls games from his perspective. Arena, he says, is really about creating the boundaries of the world, creating the lore, and understanding that place. Daggerfall, as we've discussed, becomes about that central character. So refining the character creation system, refining the skills and the leveling and the interactions that an individual character can do. Morrowind, which I focused on here, is about building out the world and making that world a space that feels vibrant, that feels distinct, and that feels alive. Oblivion, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment, is about adding in the NPCs. And we can talk about how successfully or unsuccessfully that happens. And then Skyrim, Howard argues, is about finding the connection between all of these pieces. So understanding how the NPCs interact with the world and the main character, how the world in turn is shaped by the NPCs and the player character, how the player character interacts with all of them. As we saw from the previous slide, when Oblivion releases, it is an even bigger hit than Morrowind was. It is highly praised. It is very well reviewed. Some of the criticisms, as I've noted, are ironically the very ones that Howard had about Daggerfall. They are the fairly generic world and the Tolkien-esque themes and landscapes. In this game, Bethesda tried to advance their NPC technology, giving specifically those things that Minkowski and Bjork mentioned, right? Their own motivation, their own schedule, their own ability to have goal-driven progression. And in the book, I explore a couple cases where that's successful, but I thought it would be fun to sort of start to close down with some examples of when they're not successful. So here are some NPC interactions from Oblivion.
I've killed far worse than you.
Isn't that abandoned house a bit spooky?
I don't even like to walk by that place. Go bother someone else.
Fine, be that way.
So the idea behind Radiant AI, which is the system that they pioneered for Oblivion, was to have the world feel like it existed when the player wasn't around. And part of that was that the NPCs should be able to have conversations with each other about various topics without having to involve the player. So NPCs weren't just sitting around waiting for the player to talk to them to have a conversation. They would have conversations with each other. In some cases, this does work seamlessly and is interesting. The ones that we remember are obviously the ones where it very much does not. There are lots of compilations on those. I think that this is an interesting element where we can understand the focus that this has for them and why they feel like it will make a believable world. But their implementation of it is just not quite there. Oh, there we go. Briefly, we'll close down talking about Skyrim. I don't think it needs to be stated the kind of success that Skyrim has had. In fact, just this morning, I was reading some people on Reddit joking that soon Todd Howard will release Skyrim for smart fridges. You'll hear comments about sweet rolls when you open your fridge. It's such a joke at this point how much it's been released, but you can't overstate the impact that Skyrim has had. And while this game has been phenomenally successful, I argue that a lot of that comes from the precedent and the groundwork that's laid in Morrowind. That Bethesda would not be where it is with Skyrim were it not for Morrowind. I also just found this really interesting. So right before I closed down for questions, I wanted to point out that apparently in May 2022, Skyrim cracked the top 20 for most games sold in the US, which is just bonkers to me. But Skyrim continues to chart on top sales charts, apparently. And with that, I will kick it over for questions.
Thank you so much, Wendi, for this presentation. Very engaging. I have many questions, but I don't want to be the first. So anybody want to open up the question period? And just to say that this is still recording, but when we'll upload the video on the YouTube channel of the conference series, the question period won't be there. So feel free to ask even silly questions. There's no issue there.